God's people, they wanted to be like their neighbors. So way back there, they said, hey, we want a king. Everybody else has got a king. We want a king. And God said, that's not really a smart move. If you have a king, then they're going to take your sons, and they're going to make them soldiers, and they're going to go to war, and they're going to take your taxes and all this kind of stuff. But they wanted one, so he gave them one. He gave them Saul. And you remember Saul looked like a king, but he didn't really fit the bill like it was perfect what he'd like to have been. And then from there, after Saul, we had David and then Solomon, and that's when the good times ended. And from there, then they had trouble. And the kingdom was split into the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and then Judah, which tended to be better than Israel overall. But from there on down, there was about 20 different kings over the next period of time here. And Josiah was on down the line. But this little handout that I have, it lists them as whether they started good and ended bad, or vice versa, however they were. And Josiah is one of the few good kings that we have listed in the kings of Judah. And he's also one of the youngest. So let's go back to 2 Kings just a minute. Let's get a little bit of background about him. His grandfather was Manasseh, who was one of the worst kings in that period. Brought in a lot of bad stuff and idol worship, and just really led the people astray in the wrong direction. But Amon, his son, came along and was not any better. Amon only lived 2 years, and he was assassinated. So that set up Josiah to be the next king, and Josiah became king. We read there in verse 1 of chapter 22. It says, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jediah, and the daughter of Adaliah of Boscath. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the ways of David his father, and turned not to the right or to the left. So Josiah was a good king. How did he become good with all the bad that was around him? His background was not good. He didn't appear to have a very good example from his father and grandfather of what it was to be a God-fearing man. So how did he make that change? Well, a lot of the experts think that it had to do with Zephaniah. Zephaniah was a prophet in his day, and also Jeremiah was in that same time period. So between the two of them and their prophecies that we read here, we think that they had a positive influence on him and made him make the change that he did. So let's read a little bit more there in 22 about of 2 Kings, a little bit about what he did. In verse 3 it says, And it came to pass in the 18th year of King Josiah that the king sent Shaphan the son of Azariah, the son of Methuselah, and a scribe in the house of the Lord, saying, Go to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may sum or count the silver which was brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the Lord have gathered of all the people. So there he decides that, based on what he's been hearing from his prophet, that we need to go back and the way it was done in the past. We need to go back to the original. So this was maybe the original restoration movement. Instead of restoring the church, he was trying to restore the worship how it was supposed to be done with the Israelites. But he had the money brought in and hired people to come in and work, to rebuild the temple. And in the course of that, here in verse 8, as it says, And Hilkiah the high priest said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And he gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. So when Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought the king word again and said, Thy servants have gathered the money that was found in the house, and have delivered it to the hand of them that do the work. And Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest hath delivered me a book. And he read it before the king. So this is amazing to me. I mean, this is God's people. And they didn't even, not only they weren't following the law, they didn't even know where it was. Okay, this was not like today where everybody's got 3 Bibles at home, probably got one in your car, one in the drawer somewhere, maybe one on your nightstand. You've got Bibles all over the house. The word that they had, what they had as a Bible at that time, they didn't even know where that one copy was. And they ran across it and said, hey, there's some good stuff in here. We need to read this. And after reading that, he made and turned and repented of how he done, which he was not a bad man to begin with, but he began to try to restore the country of Judah and back to the way they should have been worshiping in the past. So that's kind of sets the stage for Zephaniah here, what's going on. So during Judah's hectic political and religious history that we mentioned there to begin with, there was a few attempts to try to reform and go back to where they had been. Josiah was the most successful of that, probably. He led a revival, we call it today, probably. And they did produce some outward change. He tore down a lot of the places that they had worshipped, the idols and the groves, cut them down, those different things, and redid the temple and had the people come back, restored the feasts that they had and the holy observances and stuff that they had at that time, and began to try to bring the people back to where they should have been. Unfortunately, that didn't last all that long. I don't know, maybe the people had just gotten so far away from where they had been for so many years that it's tough to bring them all back in just a short time that he was able to reign. But Zephaniah definitely, we think, had a big part in his conversion there and his trying to become a good king. And the name Zephaniah actually means Yahweh hides, or God hides or has hidden. Now, what does that mean particularly? What did he hide? Well, we have a verse here in chapter 2 of Zephaniah where he mentions hiding. But another theory of this is that maybe that Zephaniah himself had been hidden as a baby. If he was truly of the royal family there, his father and grandfather had been involved in some terrible worship, and one particular to the god of the Ammonites, I think, or Moabites. That was their god Molech. And what they did there is they offered children live offerings to that. Well, they were live to begin with, but not after they offered them. But they burned them alive. And one of the kings actually had his own sons as babies. He offered them to this god. And if that's true, then if he was hidden away, kind of like Moses in the basket, so that they didn't kill him, then maybe that's what we meant there by that he was hidden. That's one theory of what that means. But interesting to think about anyway, about how he got to be that way. So the book of Zephaniah is really divided up into three, like I said, 3 chapters, and each one of them has kind of a theme to it. The overall tone of this book is not very happy. Okay, it's grim, it's gloom and doom of all the bad things that's going to happen, what God's going to do to Judah, and also to their neighbors around them. That finally He's going to make them pay for some of the bad things they've been doing for all these years. And but at the end, He has some good news. He saves the best for last. That there will be a time when they will be back in their country and things will be better. But he starts out in chapter 1 with the judgment of Judah. And then in chapter 2, he talks about their neighbors. And then in chapter 3, a little bit more about what will happen to Judah. Then he ends up telling some good things that's going to happen to them in the end. So we kind of look at that as we go through tonight and think about some of those things. Let's talk a little bit about the sins of Judah. In the prophets of the last 50 years or so of Judah's existence as a country, as an independent kingdom, pretty much all unanimous in condemnation. It was all pretty much bad stuff they tell them was going to happen. The influence of Manasseh and his son, even like we said, was very pervasive. The people were all into idolatry, immorality, all kinds of pagan worship, all these different things. It was very bad. And if you remember when God's people first came into the land of Canaan, when He gave it to them, He told them, "Don't mix with these people. They're bad people." He said, "Keep to yourselves. Don't marry or intermarry." But they did, and when they did that, it brought in problems. Which, even Solomon, in all his wisdom, one of his weaknesses was that he had a lot of wives and concubines, and some of those were foreigners, and they led him to, in his later years, he got soft and started letting them do whatever they wanted to do as far as worship. And so that's kind of where that all began. But it had gotten bad over the last few hundred years here. And They were worshiping Baal, like I said, Milcom, Ammonites, all these different guys. They worshiped the sun, the moon, the stars, anything you can think of, they were worshiping. Which has to do, they talk about sometimes about the high places. What they meant by that, well, they thought if they were at the highest point, at the mountaintop or the hilltop, they would be closer to those gods. So that's why they built some of their altars to these false gods there. But not only that, but they were greedy, selfish. It got to be where it was all about me. Whatever I can do for me is not what I can do for my fellow man or for God. And basically the story of Christianity is there's two basic, if you want to boil it down to the simplest part, Christianity is basically doing two things: love God and love your neighbor. If you do those two things, you're going to be all right. That was not what they were doing. They were not loving God, and they were definitely not loving their neighbor. It was all the me concepts. Let's look in Zephaniah here in chapter 1 and go down to about verse 7 and 8. Well, start with verse 6. And them that are turned back from the Lord, and those that have not sought the Lord nor inquired for him. So not only were they not seeking him, they weren't praying to him. They weren't having anything to do with God. Hold thy peace in the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. For the Lord hath prepared a sacrifice, he hath bid his guests. Over and over, probably the most common phrase in this book is in the day of the Lord. What that means is the judgment day, the day when he's going to call them to pay for all the things that they've done. Verse 8, and said, it shall come to pass in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children and all such as are clothed with strange or foreign apparel. They not only were acting like it, but they were dressing like them. Okay, does that sound familiar? To us, we want to be like people around us. Our kids especially are do that. Whatever the style of the day is, they want to do that. If everybody's wearing polo, they want polo. They want the horseman on their shirt. If they're wearing Nike shoes, they all want Nike shoes. So we want to blend in and be like the folks around us. The people of that day were the same way. Not only would they act like them, they wanted to look like them. It says in verse 9, in the same day also will I punish all those that leap on the threshold, which fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. Now, what does that mean? Leap on the threshold or leap over the threshold? Well, that verse there particularly goes back and talks about that they are following the superstitions of these people too. The Philistines had a little thing they came up with where they thought it was bad luck to step on the threshold, so they would step over it. And that all goes back to a story earlier when the Israelites were in battle, and it was one time when they're always supposed to ask God before they went to battle, are you going with us? Do we need to do this? And this one time they didn't. They trusted in themselves. And not only that, but they took the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they got beat. And not only did they get beat, but the enemy, the Philistines, took the Ark of the Covenant as a prize. And they took it. They said, "Oh no! Not only we beat them, we've got their holy thing here." So they put it in their temple, to show it off and to their idols. And when they came back the next day, the next morning the idol had fell off its perch and was laying on the floor, face down. So they pick it up, put it back on the perch, which is kind of weird. I mean, I was supposed to be worshiping this thing, and I have to pick it up and set it where it's supposed to be. But anyway, so they come back the next day, same thing. This time, as it fell, it's broken and busted everywhere and laying in the threshold. They have to step over it to get in and out of their temple. So that's kind of where this not stepping on the threshold thing came from. But he mentions that even here in verse 9, is that they act like them, they dress like them, they keep instead of talking to the God, to the true God, worshiping Him, that they're worshiping these idols, and they're even went so far as to follow their little superstitions of how they behave. So the people have gotten far, far away from where they should be. Verse 10, it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord, that there shall be a noise of the cry from the fish gate, and a howling from the second, and a great crashing from the hills. So here he's telling them the things that are going to happen to them because of these things that they have done. Verse 14, he begins there talking about the description of the judgment and the bad things that are going to happen to them. like I said, this book is not, it's not a happy book, and it tells a lot of the bad things anyway. All right, let's go to chapter 2. Starts out here in chapter 2, talks about a call for repentance. So he does mention to them again, gather yourselves together, yea, gather together, O nation not desired. Before the decrees bring forth, before the day passeth as the chaff, behold, the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger came upon you. So here again, you hear that day of the Lord he mentions. So Zephaniah's vision here, and going back to Nahum, we mentioned that last week, but in Nahum, he did not hear the Lord heard. He took him and let him watch. He saw a vision of what the destruction of Nineveh was going to be like. But here in this one, this is the word that was spoken to Zephaniah. So he got his prophecy a little different here. I thought that might be interesting to think about a little bit. Going back, I left this off in the chapter 1. I forgot that one. But the day here he's talking about that when he gets detailed about what it's going to look like is telling the people what's going to happen with the Babylonian invasion and conquest of Judah. Remember last week we talked about how they were not overrun by the Assyrians, who had took the northern kingdom, took Israel and took them back and scattered them. And when they came against Jerusalem, they were stopped. The good King Hezekiah, he had stopped them, but in the next time that they were invaded, it was going to be by the Babylonians, and they would conquer Judah. And that would take place about 35 years after this prophecy came. So in our time, that's not that much time passed before that would happen. Which, let's go back and let me say this about what we were reading there in chapter 22 of 2 Kings. Even in those days, and Zephaniah was making this prophecy, and we said that we think that that's why Josiah did well. So he listened to this prophecy and he tried to lead the people back. It just didn't last. But God had told even him at that day, he told him, said, these things are going to happen. These bad things are going to happen. Judah's going to be destroyed. They're going to be carried away, and they're going to be defeated. He said, but since you have done well, I make you this promise. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. You're not going to have to see it. So this 35 years later was after the death of Josiah. So Josiah, the good king, listened to this prophecy that we're reading here and led Judah, tried to lead them back to doing right. And because of that, God didn't let him have to be a part of this and see the destruction that was going to happen to Judah. He knew he told him it was going to happen. He said, but for your sake, you're not going to have to be a witness to that. So in chapter 2, he's talking about Judah, but he also talks about their enemies. And he talks about their enemies to the south, to the east, west, and north. And he lists those different people that they've had problems with. The Philistines are on the west. The Philistines were a group that came to Canaan about the same time that the Israelites did, when God gave them that country. But sometimes you see in the Bible called the Sea People. They were immigrants who had come from the island of Crete, and they had sailed in there and established a foothold there on the Mediterranean coast. And they were on the west side of Judah, and they were always given problems. And reading in the Old Testament about especially Samson and his problems with the Philistines. So that was one group there. And then in verse 8, he starts talking about the Moabites and the Ammonites. But these were the people that were on the east side of them. So on the other side, a little bit about them and where they came from. Sometimes we get the idea that, God's awful tough on these people that are around them. Well, they had their chance too. The Moabites and the Ammonites were descended from the two sons that were born to Lot's daughters. If you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot's wife turned to look back, she turned into a pillar of salt. Well, Lot and his two daughters traveled on. Well, his daughters were afraid that there was nobody else around, that they weren't going to be able to have children, and they was going to die out. Their line would die out. So the story is that they got their father Lot intoxicated, slept with him. Both of them became pregnant by their dad, and these are the those two children are the fathers of these peoples here. So they used to be kinsmen of Abraham and part of them, but they branched off from that and went down a bad path. So these are the people here that they're having trouble with now. So they were on the east side of them, and they talk. And he judges here. He says, they're always threatening and breathing out problems against my people. And then in verse 12, he talks about to the south, or the Egyptians, or he calls them the Ethiopians. He doesn't say a whole lot about all the bad things that they've done, but they were a people that was that were enemies of God's people here, of the Israelites. And then beginning in verse 13, he talks again about Assyria. Now, when we mentioned last week about Assyria and where they were from, Assyria was not exactly north of them, but there was a big desert between them and Assyria. So in order for Assyria, the Assyrians to attack, they had to go across from the east to the west and then come down from the north. So when he says they're coming from the north, if you ever look at a map of the ancient times over there and where everybody was, you might have said, well, they're not in the north. Well, technically they weren't, but that's where they came from when they invaded and came down to give them trouble. It was always from the north. So he talks here about these people and what he's going to do to them. And, it's kind of like he says about the Israelites, people of Judah. They get to the point where they think they can do whatever they want to, and I'm not going to do anything to them. That's not true. He says it will come to pass that there will be a day of reckoning, the day of judgment, when they will pay for what they've done. I'm trying to find that verse. I forgot where that one was. But in verse 18, going back to the Judah, he says, neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he shall make even a swift riddance of all them that dwell in the land. So, he says it doesn't matter. Your money's not going to save you. Your pride's not going to save you. None of these things. They had got to the point where they think, well, God's not going to do anything. I can do whatever I want to. There's going to be no consequences. But we know that's not true. Same way when us as children, we may have got by with something, but we'll eventually get caught up with. Personal story. My dad was very strict, and to say the least. My friends were more scared of my daddy than they were their daddy. So when they came over, they knew, and if I ever went anywhere, and they were driving, they said, what time's your curfew? Because you're not going to be late. I don't want to bring you late to your daddy's house. But and when you got in trouble, and if you had a whipping coming, you took it and you didn't question it, and you didn't try to say I didn't do it. But one time, I was probably 13 or 14, I guess, and I've been accused of doing something, and I was brave enough, and I said, Dad, I didn't do that. And he didn't get mad that time. He just looked at me and he said, you know what? You might not have, but I said, I bet you did something else one other time I didn't catch you, so I'm going to go ahead and whip you. We're going to call it even. I said, I can't argue with that. So that's kind of how this was with these people. They might have got by with it at one point, but there's a day of reckoning coming when you're going to pay. So that was my time that time. I paid for some other things I'd done maybe, but not that one in particular. So in chapter 3 here, he begins to talk about Jerusalem's injustice. He said, woe to her that is filthy and polluted for the oppressing city. She obeys not the voice. She received nor correction. She trusted not in the Lord. She drew not near to her own God. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow. Her prophets are lying and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary and have done violence to the law. So again, he's talking about some things they've done. And then in verse 5, and the just Lord is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity every morning till he brings his judgment to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame. It says, I have cut off the nations, their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste. The none passes by, their cities are destroyed. So if there's no man, there is none inhabitant. Which goes back to what we talked about Nineveh last week. When the Nineveh was destroyed, it was wiped down to where they couldn't even find a trace of it for hundreds of years until the 1850s when they actually found that there was actually a place that existed. They thought it was just, fables or just something, a story in the Bible, but they since then found it to be true. Now, the good news is, it's in the end of chapter 3. He tells them that there will be a time when they will come back. There will be a remnant left. And we've heard that many times, probably in different lessons about the remnant. But the ones who are left will be humbled, and the haughty and proud, the ones who wouldn't listen, they're going to be punished and done away with. In verse 8, therefore wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to pray. For thy determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. And then begins the good part here in verse 9. For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one consent. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, or remnant, even the daughters of my dispersed, shall bring mine offerings. In that day thou shalt not be ashamed for all thy doing, wherein thou hast transgressed against me. For then I will take away out of the midst of them what rejoice in thy pride, and thou wilt no more be haughty because of thy holy mountain. I also will leave to the midst of the unafflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. So he says the ones who are left, the ones who are going to be faithful, that's where we're going to come from. Okay, so I think about this, doing away with the evil ones and leaving the good. It's kind of reverse, but when you on antibiotics, they tell you to take all of it. You don't, not when you start feeling better, quit taking it, but you take all of it. And why is that? Well, because if you just take a certain amount, then you kill off the weaker ones, and the stronger ones then have less competition, and they're going to multiply and be back. And that's bad. You don't want the infection in you. But turn that around on the good side, that's kind of how it was here. He's going to do away with all the bad ones, and the ones who are left, the strong ones, and they will be able to thrive and do well. So that's kind of the promise that he makes to them. It says, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all thy heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. For the Lord hath taken away thy judgment, he hath cast out thine enemies, the King of Israel, even the Lord, in the midst of these that thou shalt see evil any more. In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, thou fear not, and to Zion, let not thine hands be slack. So here he's telling them there's going to be a time when that comes back. So, it's a punishment basically, but they're going to be better for it. Again, maybe when you were younger and you got in trouble, your parents said, I'm going to give you a whipping, but it's going to hurt me worse than it does you, although I never really believed that. But after I got older and had my own kids, I did see that it's tough when you have to discipline your own. It does hurt you and disappoint you. And that's kind of how God was with them. But, at the end, you turn out better for it. I heard one fellow say, when I was 16, my parents were the stupidest people in the world. And then when I got to be 20, they were a little smarter. And when I got to be 30, I figured just how smart they really were. So as you get a little older, you understand why they did what they did, and they did have some wisdom and all that. So that's kind of how the people are here. They're seeing that from God, that he's being tough on them, some of that tough love, but it's going to make them better in the end as a people. And having been a coach for a long time, that I can relate to that. If you're easy on your team in practice, they're not going to be ready for the ball games. I think it was one of Tennessee's old coach, maybe it was Bob Naylor way back in the day, but he was famous for his tough practices and how hard they were. And they asked him about that one day. So you're not afraid you're going to tear your players down? He said, you don't develop strong teeth eating mush. You gotta develop and get hard. And probably the most famous story of that's Bear Bryant when he was coaching at Texas A&M before he ever came to Alabama. And the Junction Boys, if y'all are football fans, you've heard that story. But, when he first came, they were not very good at all. And so he gathered up all the players and he took them by, I think it was 2 or 3 busloads of them way out to this little place, way out in the rough, so Army base or something. And they stayed there for about 2 weeks. And when they came back, the ones that was left was plenty of room on one bus. So it was famous for how hard those practices were, and he was trying to toughen them up and thin them out, and that remnant, like it is here, of those players who survived, who stayed, and did what he asked them to do and toughened up, they end up winning the Southwest Championship out there, 2 or 3 years later. And he told stories that later Bear Bryant did. That was one of his favorite teams he ever coached, was those guys, because of how successful they were in life after football. How many of them became successful businessmen and doctors and coaches themselves and all the different things, but because they took those lessons and made them better. But they would not have done that had he been easy on them. And I know myself, having played for a few tough coaches down through the years, and I know one particular day when he got mad at us, and we ran sprints for about 45 minutes, I guess, and every time he'd blow the whistle, we'd all say, I'm not running another one, I'm quitting, that's it, but we'd run, and we'd finish, and we survived, and then looking back, those days that made you tougher, some things you went through later, and it's like, well, nothing was as tough as that was. I know as a freshman, when I was on the scout team in high school, the state one year decided that they were going to experiment that year and let us start practice in the middle of July instead of early August. So we practiced 6 weeks in the heat before we ever played a game, and I was on the scout team, which I was getting beat up every day. I was not like I was one of the best ones out there, and it was a long summer, but it toughened me up and made me a better player at the end. So you had to kind of pay your dues to get where you are, and that's kind of how the people were here. God was putting them through this tough time, discipline them, tough love, so that one day they would be a better people for who they were, and they would learn that he meant what he said when he said, do what I say. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. As principal, I had a teacher one time, she come to me with a child, and she said, this student said, they're not acting like they're supposed to, I'm bringing them to you. I said, what happened? She said, well, I told them 3 times. I said, okay, why did you tell them 3 times? Because they knew you was going to keep telling them. If you tell them once and say, this is the consequences, then they're going to do what you said. But if they know you're going to tell them 3 or 4 times before you ever do anything, then they're going to keep pushing it. So that's what God was here. He said, I've told you. Now it's time to pay the piper, So this was the lesson from Zephaniah was that God will do what he says, and he will reward those who are faithful to him. He will punish those who need punishing. I know we look around sometimes and think, why all these people are living ungodly lives, and look how they've got it made. I'm trying to do right, and look what I'm suffering. How is that fair, God? I said this in another class I taught recently, but I heard this in something recently I was studying, and it really hit home to me, and maybe it will with you. But the statement was when this happens, when you look around and you feel like you're being persecuted for doing right, and everybody in the world around you is living sinful, and they're enjoying life and having the best of everything, how is that fair? And they said, think about it this way. Those people that are living that kind of life now, that's the closest to heaven they'll ever get. And then they're going to pay for that in the afterlife. For us, no matter how much we suffer, even if we suffer like the first century Christians did, where we're persecuted and stoned and killed and all that, that's the closest to hell that a Christian will ever get, is what happens to us on earth. The best is yet to come. So if we think about what we endure here on earth, whether it be good or bad, and we consider that, I think that can be a lot of comfort to us, is that no matter how bad it is here on earth, this is a short time. And, we're told if you're persecuted for doing good, count that as joy. Be glad, because that means you're on the right side of things. If the world is telling you you're great, then that's probably not good. You don't want those people telling you you're doing great. So, and if they're enjoying all the riches and parties and all that kind of stuff, that's the best they're going to have. And then after that, they're going to have to put up with the bad part of that in judgment in the afterlife. So that really struck to me and made me a little bit of comfort about, sometimes if things not going good, I need to think about it that way. I'm suffering a little bit now, but I'll have joy forever after, and not the opposite of that. All right, we got about 5 minutes or so left. Any questions or comments on our lesson tonight? Our lessons in here usually take a lecture form where the teacher stands up here and talks and we don't interact, but really the best lessons are when we do have a little interaction from the students and come back and ask questions. And I'll tell you, probably better than 50% chance I won't know the answer, but we'll figure it out together. That's what makes it fun. Make me think. Your best classes are the ones where the students make the teacher think about what are the answers to that. Hopefully you're enjoying our series for the minor prophets. I think I told you the first time I was up here, I've taught this series one time before, and I taught it to a teenage class, and that was tough. I was getting teenagers interested in this, but it's much easier. Older people have a little bit more background in these kind of things, but I think it does help us to go back and we're told the Old Testament is a schoolmaster to bring us where we are. The New Testament, we learn a lot of lessons from things there. Saying, what does that have to do with me? Things that happened to people 1,000 years ago. Well, it has a lot. The same things, same lessons apply. The same things that they learn, we can learn. And it's always better to learn by somebody else's mistakes than it is by our own. I worked with a man one time. He was famous for a lot of sayings, but one of his best ones was, everybody's good for something if it's just a bad example. So we read in the Old Testament about how tough God was on these people. We look at why was he like that. So we don't want to go the same thing they did. And unfortunately, I think if we look around in our world sometimes, we feel like maybe we are living in the same kind of times when what began as a Christian nation may be moving away from that. And, the fact that they were killing babies, we see that in our society where there's millions of them killed through abortion all the time. So, the value of life is not that much, and it's all about the dollar and what makes me happy instead of serving my fellow man. And so I think we need to go back and learn some of these same things that he taught his people here. Anybody else? Any comment? Well, I appreciate your attention tonight. I think Ben will be back next Wednesday, I believe. And he will be in and out during the summer, but I think he will be back next Wednesday. But encourage you to, once we touch on these things, hopefully this will just kind of, in a little 45-minute class, will be just enough to kind of pique your interest and make you want to study a little bit more on your own and read up on some of these things that are said. Hopefully you'll be like the Bereans and, don't take my word for it, but look at your Bible and see if the things are taught to you are so or not. One of the problems in our what's Christianity today as a broad term is that too many people have gotten lazy and they just take whatever the preacher or the teacher says without checking it out for themselves. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical. Like I said, hopefully it made you think. Another thing from education is, I heard a teacher one time fussing and said, these kids like this, they don't want to do anything. They don't want to learn. He said, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And the answer to the teacher was, it's not your job to make them drink. It's your job to make them thirsty. So, you got to make them want to learn. So hopefully I've made you a little thirsty tonight and you'll want to drink a little bit and find out a little bit more about this. I've done this for you. Bow with me. We'll close with a prayer. Yes, sir. Go right ahead. Betty Clemens. Okay. All right. If you will, bow with me, we'll include her in her prayer tonight. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity you've given us to come together and to study on the lesson of thy word. Father, that you be the ones who are not able to be with us tonight, especially with Betty Clemens in the fall. Pray that you be with her and with the ones who are caring for her. Pray that they will be able to do those things. You give them wisdom and guide their hands that they might do things that restore their health. Father, pray that you be with Brother Ben as he travels, that give him and his family safety, and they'll be back with us the next opportunity. Be with those, Father, who are not just spiritually sick, or not physically sick, but spiritually sick, and that they would look to you, the great physician, the only one who can heal them. Father, be with us. Pray that we would continue to study thy word, and we would look for things and opportunities to make ourselves stronger Christians, not only to strengthen ourselves, but so we could share the good news with someone else, and we might bring more people to thee. Be with us on throughout this week till we meet again on Sunday to worship you again. I pray in Christ's name. Amen.